So we published and presented this work in various academic conferences, and then
You said, I'm
later,
sorry, if you don't mind, I want to go back to something because
yeah,
we got off it. You said when you studied his poetry, it was particularly haunting.
yeah.
Why was that? Like, did it at some point, did you start to notice yourself thinking, I don't really know how to ask this, but thinking about geopolitics and the ways of the world naturally and like a lot just because of what you were witnessing, meaning it's not your job, but like you're naturally becoming an expert on some of these things?
Well, it was both. It was kind of organic because the other way I got interested in this work was in the early 90s. I had read a profile of Saddam Hussein that was published by my friend and mentor, the late Dr. Gerald Post, who founded the unit that profiles world leaders at CIA and worked there for 21 years.
So that's the unit John Kiriakou worked for then,
Yeah,
because he was Saddam's
that
chief
was
profiler.
Kiriakou was a student of Post at GW.
Yep.
And
he talked about him.
Yeah.
Yes.
Post is a legend. Well, I got connected with Post. I had read his work and his work on profiling terrorists and world leaders, and I thought, this is some of the coolest stuff in the world. I got to learn more about this in the early 90s.
Yeah.
And so I dug up whatever papers were in the open source literature and in the medical library. And then in 1995, I started working on a profile of Dr. Radovan Karadzic, who was then the leader of the Bosnian Serb Republic, but was also a psychiatrist and published poet, and had been indicted for war crimes and
he was
genocide.
doing the genocide.
So I got Karadzic's poetry together and translated it, all of it, at the time. Took me a couple months, and it was really haunting. And the American Psychiatric Association the year before had condemned him for his role in the genocide before the indictments came out and got, quote, unsealed. And I was really intrigued, like, how could a psychiatrist who was, by all reports, an okay psychiatrist, he was a talented poet, cultured person, get involved in mass murder? So I wanted to write a profile about him. So I called up Post and just out of the blue, and we talked, and I told him I'd read his work, and he goes, what are you working on? And I said, I'm developing a profile of Radovan Karadzic. He goes, oh, wow, that's amazing. So am I. We need to meet. So he flew down to Dallas a month later. He had to go to a wedding, and we had a 4-hour brunch and kind of talked shop.
Whoa.
And then we ended up publishing this profile and presenting it at GW where he was teaching. He asked me to do a presentation in 1995.
This is before you're working.
Before my State Department. I was an academic.
Yeah.
And
wow.
When it was real funny doing I was in DC to take my back then they had these very difficult oral board exams where you had to interview a live patient in front of a bunch of experts, psychiatrists, and it's very stressful.
A real patient.
A real patient. I did my oral exam at St. Elizabeth's Hospital.
Wow.
I interviewed a schizophrenic for half an hour, and then they're pimping you and asking you questions. What do you think of this? What about this diagnosis? All that. It's very demanding. It's so stressful they got rid of it.
It's kind of strange too, because you have a human being.
Yeah, they dumbed it down and got rid of it because the fail rates were high.
Yeah.
But when I was there, Post said, could you give a presentation at GW on Karadzic? I go, sure. So I gave an hour-and-a-half presentation, lots of questions. They had journalists there who interviewed me in Serbian. And they had people from the government. And when you go around the table and they go, I'm George, I'm Frank, I'm Mike. I'm like, okay, I get it.
Yeah.
And they didn't ask any questions. They never asked direct questions. The questions would be asked through Dr. Post, and then he'd call me up a few weeks later and said, one of my friends who was at the talk asked, what do you think of this and this and this? I'm like, okay. So we published and presented this work in various academic conferences, and then
you said,
later,
I'm sorry, if you don't mind, I want to go back to something because we got off it. You said when you studied his poetry, it was particularly haunting.
Yeah.
Why was that?
Because in his poems that were written in the late 60s about Sarajevo or in the early 70s, there's themes of destruction and war and horror that come out in the poetry. Like he sees Sarajevo burning. And that poem was written in 1968. So it's in the depths of his unconscious.
Like he wants
And it
to
played
happen.
out
Yeah.
15 or 20 years later
Wow.
in 1992 and through 95 in Bosnia. I found that just unbelievable.
How does he's a whole different case because he, as you said, he was literally a psychiatrist. You would think someone like this would have some more awareness of human beings.
He was trained in Tavistock in group therapy. In Britain, he spent a year at Columbia. That was very interesting. We tried to dig that up. There's Columbia said we have no record of him being.
Yeah, sure you do. Sure you don't.
I called them. We tried to dig it up. I talked to government people, and they go, can't find any record. I'm like, what was he doing in New York for a year? And he's not on the rolls on the registry. Every student's on the registry.
Well, they had whiteout.
Yeah. Back then.
Yeah.
So, and he was a talented poet. Now, one of the biases that creeps in is once he got charged with war crimes and genocide, people said, "Oh, his poetry is crap." But he got all these awards at the time, and now with his ego and his vanity, he said, "Oh well." He gave an interview where he said, "I'm the greatest poet in the Serbian language." That's probably a stretch, but he was a decent poet. So I enjoyed trying to understand his how that plays out in his political decision making and his frankly his cunning. He managed to evade capture for close to 15 plus years, and even now when you drive in the Bosnian Serb Republic, there are posters of him. He's a hero.
He's a hero.
Yeah, to them.
Genocidal maniac's a hero.
Yes.
All right, let's start here. How does a guy like that, especially with the background he has, psychologically speaking, from your expertise, and you also literally studied him individually, how does a guy like that get his mind to a point where not only can he accept genocide, he can start it and cheer it on.
And justify it. He said in a famous quote, "I'm willing to sacrifice an entire generation of Serbs so that the Bosnian Serb Republic can be pure," i.e. cleansed of Muslims.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So how did he go from being a psychiatrist who empathized with patients, took care of patients, wrote poetry, to a person who was responsible for genocide? He, quote unquote, and this came out in his trial, he said, with Srebrenica, this is the tragic attack in July of 1995, where 7,000 Bosnian men, women, and children were slaughtered in one day. He said, "I took full command responsibility for the actions of the Serb military, the Bosnian Serb military in Srebrenica, and I am satisfied with the outcome." So that goes to legal doctrines of command responsibility, going back to the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo war crimes trials in World War II.
Yep.
So Karadzic was a figure. There was he was an interesting creative figure, but he obviously had a lot of dark matter in his DNA that came out. The destructiveness and the brutality of what his government and his forces carried out is stunning. And now Robert Lifton, a legendary psychiatrist and scholar, had written about this in the Nazi Doctors. So in trying to understand Karadzic, I went back and read that work about the T4 euthanasia program.
T4 euthanasia program.
In Germany and in Austria, which was run by psychiatrists that allowed them to euthanize disabled children.
Right.
That was the precursor to the final solution, because
pull that mic in a little bit.
In order to commit genocide for a country, you have to dehumanize the other.
That's right.
And in Germany, they used a phrase. My German's not so good, but in the translation would be "life unworthy of life," or in the Bosnian Serb case, they had to dehumanize the Muslims and say that they were unworthy. And these debates in Serbia and in the Bosnian Serb part took place in the 80s and early 90s on the front page of the news every day. It wasn't secret. The dehumanization preceded the genocide. You have to create hatred first. And every genocide that I've studied carefully in doing this kind of profiling research has that component. Rwanda, same thing. The radio had to create the hatred against the Tutsis. You know,
Why do we do this over and over again?
because we're human, unfortunately. The people, Post and I wrote a review of a very brilliant psychobiography of Adolf Hitler written by a psychiatrist who taught at Yale named Fritz Redlich. And one of the things we wrote in that review was that as long as people are human, these kind of leaders will periodically emerge and will be asking that same excellent question that you just asked. Because they don't do it because they're mentally ill. Karadzic is not mentally ill or psychotic, or it's evil. And we don't, evil is a theological and moral term more than a psychological term. We can use psychological terms like psychopathy, but evil is broader. It has more depth to it. I testified in a capital murder case once, and a prosecutor asked me, "Doctor," he handed me the DSM-4 and said, "Can you look up the diagnosis of evil in the index?" And I knew where he was going with this because it's not there. I said, I looked, took my time, and said, "There's no such diagnosis. This is a moral concept." So I think that's the way, from studying leaders like Karadzic. Later, Post and I studied, wrote about, and presented our profile of Slobodan Milosevic in 1999, the week that the war started.
Oh, you did one on that too?
Yes. And then, of course, my studies of Vladimir Putin, who's been indicted for genocide.
Yes.
These are questions I've wrestled with my entire professional career, trying to understand exactly what you're asking.
Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.